Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to yet another Eracy webinar. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land where I'm standing, and that's the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I also welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating today. As Paul indicated, our webinar today is entitled The Labour Market Outlook for the Young in Australia and How Policy Can Help. In the decade following the global financial crisis, getting into work became progressively more difficult for the young in Australia. Then along came COVID-19. While the overall labour market appears to be recovering strongly, there is emerging evidence that it is the young who will experience the most persistent adverse impacts to their employment due to the pandemic. The costs for the young from being out of employment at the start of their working lives are now well known to be potentially long-lasting, a phenomenon referred to as scarring. Today, Professor Jeff Borland will review evidence on the current labour market outlook for young Australians. He'll also talk to us about the potential impact of job scarring, as well as policy ideas for improving employment opportunities for young people. Jeff is Trupy Williams Professor of Economics at the University of Melbourne. His main research interests are the analysis of labour markets in Australia, program and policy evaluation and design, and Australia's economic history. Jeff is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and in 2010 he received the annual Distinguished Fellow Award from the Economic Society of Australia. He is currently a member of the board of the Committee for Economic Development in Australia and a good friend to us here at Eracy. Jeff has also contributed to our work, particularly the Children and Young People's Knowledge Acceleration Hub, our joint effort with UNICEF Australia, in which we try to ensure COVID recovery policies for young people are evidence-based. And for that, we look to the best evidence. And so today, we look to Jeff. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Iraqi and to Penny Paul for the invitation to talk today. What I wanted to do in this talk was several things. First of all, give you a bit of background on labour market outcomes for the young, talking both about what was happening to the young in the decade after the GFC, that is in the period leading up to 2020 and COVID-19, and then more specifically about the impact of COVID-19. Then to talk about the phenomenon of scarring, which I think is a real concern, at least for one sizable group of young people coming out of COVID-19, and then finish up by talking about policy approaches. So I'll work sequentially through those topics. It is important to be aware that even before COVID-19 hit, there were deteriorating employment outcomes for the young in Australia, and those outcomes have really been deteriorating ever since the period after the GFC in Australia in 2008. It appears that what happened in this decade after the GFC is that the young were basically bore the brunt of increased labour market, increased competition for jobs, increased competition in the labour market. In the decade following the GFC, we had slower rate of growth in employment, but continued strong growth in labour force participation. And so I'll say something more about this in a minute, but I think one really important thing in thinking about the labour market for young people is making a distinction between what I think are really two separate labour markets for young people. First of all, there are a group of young people who are full-time students, and they are usually looking for part-time, relatively low-skill jobs. I'll make that point in a minute with a slide. That group in the past decade have seen significant increase in competition because of very rapid growth in short-term immigration of young people, working holiday makers and international students. non-full-time students, so for example, people who finish their education, people who are completing their education part-time, they are usually seeking full-time work and usually seeking, based on having a broad array of qualifications, seeking work consistent with those qualifications in a broader set of occupations than full-time students. The non-full-time students have really seen increased competition then across the board. They've seen increased competition because aggregate labour force participations continue to grow when growth in employment has been slower after the GFC. And so that growth in labour force participation has been due to things like continued delayed retirement by older workers. So we've seen deteriorating employment outcomes for young people since the GFC that can be mainly attributed to young people bearing the brunt of a squeeze between labour demand and labour supply, slowing labour demand, continuing growth in labour supply. Young people are the ones who are trying to make the transition into work, and so they're the ones who get impacted worst when there's this squeeze between labour supply and labour demand. Now, there's a whole variety of reasons that the proportion of the young in employment, something economists refer to as the employment population rate, might be decreasing. We know that the young always bear the brunt of business cycles. We know that young people's education participation has been increasing, and that if they're participating in education, they're less likely to be in employment. You might be thinking that, well, maybe the industry composition of employment's changed in a way that is acting against young people. In fact, if you go through and look at all of those explanations, none of those explanations can account for why young people's employment decreased in the decade following the GFC. And so in some joint work with my colleague Mick Coelho in the Economics Department of the University of Melbourne, we've estimated that the proportion of young people in employment in the decade after the GFC fell by about 4 percentage points because of this increased competition effect, slowing growth in labour demand compared to increase in labour supply. And that's against sort of about what was before the GFC an employment population rate of about 60%. So 4 percentage points is a sizable effect. There's been an effect on overall employment, but the impact of increased competition for in the labour market on young people has been manifested in a variety of other ways. Young people finish the decade with higher likelihood of part-time employment, lower quality starting jobs, higher likelihood of long-term unemployment, and an increased incidence of unpaid internships as an extra form of competition to get into work. Now, I just wanted to sort of make a few of those points a bit more concrete by showing you a few sort of graphs, some data. So this is a graph that is really background. It just makes the point that I was describing before about how there are really two labour markets for the young. What I've got in this graph is a whole lot of occupations, and for each of the occupations, the orange bars show the share of employment in that occupation accounted for by full-time students aged 15 to 24. Now, not all of the occupations have shown up because there's too many occupations. The top 4 bars, in fact, refer to sales assistants and sales persons, hospitality workers, sales support workers, and food preparation assistants. Those are the top 4 bars. And you can see, for example, food preparation assistants, the orange bars over 35, and what that's saying is that full-time students aged 15 to 24 make up over a third of that workforce. And you can see that they also make up a large proportion of sales assistants and hospitality workers and sales support workers, which are the other ones in the top 4. Then the blue line shows the share of employment of full-time students aged 15 to 24 years. So the blue line tells you really how concentrated are young people in these 4 occupations. And so if you add the numbers up, you can see you've got 30 and 15 and 10 and 10. what that's telling you is that basically about 55 to 60% of full-time students work in just these 4 occupations, sort of. So this graph is just giving you a feel for the point I made, that when I think about the labour market for young people, I think of there being really 2 separate labour markets. The labour market for full-time students who are looking for part-time work in a very narrow set of occupations, and the broader market for young people who finish their education, who are really spread much more broadly across the set of occupations, and therefore are competing with a much broader set of the labour force in looking for work. So in this slide, I've tried to give you a bit of a perspective on the idea that that after the GFC, the Australian labour market's got a more difficult place to get into employment. So this graph, it sort of runs from 1991 to 2019, but I've benchmarked it in 2008, which is when the GFC happened. I've sort of used that as the reference point. What I'm describing in this graph is labour underutilisation. So that's basically unemployment and underemployment. It's the amount of spare capacity in the Australian labour market, and I've got the blue dashed line for the whole population and the brown line for young people. The fact that both of the lines are moving downwards in the period up until the GFC says that labour underutilisation was decreasing both for the whole of the workforce and for young people, and in fact, more so for young people than the whole of the population in the period before the GFC. So labour underutilisation was coming down. But then you can see that the GFC was a real break point. After that, labour underutilisation has actually been increasing, both for the whole of the workforce, that's the blue dashed line, but also you can see even more significantly for young people, basically increasing by about 8 percentage points. So this is the idea that that in overall terms, that there's been this growing gap between labour supply and labour demand in the Australian labour market since the GFC. So yeah, in this slide, what I've got is the proportion of different age group populations in employment. And here I'm showing it from 1978 to 2019 again with the black line showing the GFC. And here I've benchmarked all of the series at 0. So you can think of this as what happened to the proportion of the population in each of these age groups in employment since 1978. And you can see that basically up to 1978, the brown dashed line, that's 25 to 54-year-olds, that's moving upwards. The grey line, which is 55 plus, the older population, that actually decreased until the early 1990s. But when we came out of that 1990s recession, you can see employment for the older population really took off. Employment for the younger population, you can see, didn't have a strong trend in the period up to the GFC, sort of going up and down. You can see a big decrease in the 1990s recession and a lot of sort of choppiness. What we're interested in is what happened after the GFC. You can see basically after the GFC, 25 to 54-year-olds, their growth in employment stalled. Growth for 55 plus continued to happen, but you can see that growth for young people 15 to 24 really dropped off. Big decrease from being 2 percentage points up compared to 1978, going down to about 4 percentage points below. So this is really making the point that when you look at these separate age groups, it's the young who've borne the brunt of the slowdown in the labour market that's happened since the GFC. This slide, I'm trying to make the point that one of the extra outcomes for young people is that it's been taking them longer to make the transition into full-time employment. So this graph shows you data on bachelor degree graduates, and it asks both 4 months after people graduate and 3 years after people graduate, what were the proportion who are in full-time employment. So for example, if these lines I've got drawn there, if they were just a perfectly horizontal line, it'd tell you that the proportion who are in full-time work was the same after 4 months and 3 years. All of them, in fact, you can see slope upwards, which mean that the proportion of people who've graduated who are in full-time work increases between 4 months after graduation and 3 years. The thing that's sort of most notable in this graph is that the gradient of the lines increases over time. So the very top line is 2007. So in 2007, about 85% of people who graduated were in full-time employment 4 months out, and about 92% 3 years out. If you look at 2015, which is the bottom line, by that stage, only about 67% were in full-time employment 4 months out, but by 3 years later, that was up to 90%. So what that's telling us is that fanning out of those lines, it's telling us that it's taking eventually similar proportions of young people are getting, young graduates are getting into full-time work, but it's taking longer. The proportion who are already in full-time employment after 4 months is much lower today than it was back in for people who graduated in 2007. Okay, this is just making the point that another outcome has been more likely to be long-term unemployed. So again, showing the break point in 2008, that long-term unemployed, the proportion had been coming down for all the age groups until 2008. After 2008, stabilizes for 25 to 54 and 55 plus age groups, but has increased for young people. So all this has been to make the point that the labour market became a more difficult place for young people between 2008 and 2019. Then along came COVID-19, and we all know that the initial impact of COVID-19 was that there were disproportionately large employment losses for young people. That's partly because they were in industries which happened to be most negatively impacted by COVID-19. So young people make up a disproportionate share of workers in hospitality, in retail, in food preparation. And so therefore, because those were the occupations and the industries, accommodation, food services that were most adversely affected, young people were most adversely affected. Of course, young people also suffered because eligibility for job seeker was restricted to people who, if they were casually employed, had been in a casual job for 12 months or more. And young people make up an above average share of people who have been in casual employment for less than a year. From May 2020 to February 2021, what we've seen is really the convergence of employment outcomes by age, but with the young still remaining somewhat behind. In particular, the big concern I have at the moment is that there's one group of the young whose recovery is really stalled, and that's non-full-time students, especially those working in full-time jobs with lower levels of education qualification. And the concern is that because, or the longer the effect of COVID on that group persists, the more there's a concern about potential scarring effects. So again, like with the previous point, I just want to show you a few graphs to make concrete what I was saying on the previous slide. Here's data from March 2020 through to February 2021, which is the most recent labour force survey data we have. And basically this shows what happens to the proportion of each of those age groups who are in employment from March 2020 onward. And the axis is zero, sort of. So the fact that all of the lines drop below zero to start off with, that's telling you there's a negative effect. And the fact that the blue line, which is for 15 to 24-year-olds, drops the most, that's picking up on the first point, that from March to May, the proportion of young people who were out of work because of COVID was much larger than 25 to 64 or 65 plus age groups, about 10 percentage points compared to about 3.5 and about 1.5% respectively. What you see after that is that as those industries, retail, hospitality, came back online, young people's employment recovered more rapidly than or there were larger recoveries in employment for young people than the older age groups. And so by about November 2020, the lines here converge sort of, but they haven't completely moved back together. The young people still are somewhat behind. And in particular, the group who are behind are the group who are not attending education full-time. So in other words, people who finished education or people who are doing education part-time. What I've got in this graph is really the same sort of graph as I had on the previous slide. It's the proportion in employment, but here I'm focusing just on young people, and I'm showing you two different groups, people who are attending full-time and people who are not attending full-time. And what this graph is telling you, look, initially there was pretty equivalent impacts on both those groups. But as time's gone on since the middle of 2020, employment for people who are attending education full-time has recovered strongly. In fact, there's a bigger proportion of people who are young people who are attending education full-time in employment today than there was back in March 2020 before COVID. But there's another group not attending education full-time who really since about September last year, they haven't seen much recovery in their employment population rate at all. And there's now sort of about a 5.5 percentage point gap between outcomes for young people who are attending full-time education and not attending full-time education. What we can also say is that that effect on non-full-time students has been pretty much concentrated on people who were previously working full-time. So in fact, there's been a bit of an increase in part-time employment for people who are non-full-time students, but big decrease in full-time employment and slightly larger effect on males than females. This is about education. This is what happened to the percentage of, this is just a change in the absolute number, well, percentage change in the number of young people not in full-time education based on their education qualification. And the message from this little table is that, look, people with a bachelor degree plus, their employment was actually increasing between 2019 and 2020. It's people with levels of education qualification below that whose employment was most adversely affected by COVID-19. As I said, the fear I have is that the longer it is that you have a negative effect on employment outcomes for this group of young people who are who finish their education or in part-time education, the greater the likelihood of scarring occurring. What is scarring? So scarring is when an adverse experience associated with macroeconomic conditions, so macroeconomic downturn has adverse effects on long-term labour market outcomes. So scarring means more than just, wow, young people are being worst affected today. As the name scarring suggests, what scarring means is that there are long-lasting effects of bad labour market outcomes today. When we think about the direct impact of adverse macroeconomic conditions today on young people, I think there's two main impacts. One is young people find it more difficult to find a job, and that means they're either going to become unemployed or they're going to move out of the labour force. And so that's kind of the data I've been showing up until now, that COVID-19 has meant that there's a smaller proportion of young people in employment. The other impact we know will be going on, for example, shown in work by the Productivity Commission last year on incomes of young people, is that for those young people who do get into work, it's more difficult for them to get into high-pay, high-quality jobs or jobs where their skills are fully utilised. So those are bad effects for young people today. What scarring says is, yep, there's those bad effects today, but those bad effects today are also likely to mean that there are bad effects tomorrow in the future. Why is that? Well, we know that unemployment today has long-term effects, skill atrophy, potentially negative effects on motivation, and stigma effects. So just the identification of having been unemployed, reducing the likelihood of employment. And we also know that in terms of the second effect of starting off in a lower quality or lower paid job, that even if the labour market bounces back, it takes time to move back up the job ladder. You can't just snap back into the job that you would have got if you hadn't been trying to get into work at a time when labour market conditions were poor. So both the effect of unemployment and starting in a lower quality, lower paid job have longer term consequences, which is what we know as scarring. And the negative effects on scarring, we know from international literature, they can be on employment, earnings, health, family income. What's the Australian evidence? Well, not extensive Australian evidence, really just one main study by Treasury. This is some data that I'd put together before the Treasury analysis last year, which just made the simple point that that people who left full-time education at times when the rate of unemployment was higher had a lower probability of getting into employment in their first year in the labour market. So what this graph shows is on the vertical axis, it tells you the proportion of young people who are in employment in the first year after finishing their education, and the horizontal axis is the rate of unemployment in the year they left education. And you can see a whole lot of dots and a line which has a negative gradient. The negative gradient's telling you that, look, in years where the rate of unemployment was higher, if you read across to the vertical axis, the proportion of people who got into employment was lower. So, for example, if the unemployment rate was around about 12 to 14%, about 75% of people who were young people were in employment in the year after leaving education. But if the unemployment rate was down around 8 or 9%, then that number was over 85%. So this is telling you, look, the macroeconomic conditions at the time of entering the labour market have an effect, not just immediately, but in the year after, and a similar graph sort of that shows 2 years after and 3 years after. The most thoroughgoing analysis of this has been done by the Treasury, analysis by Dan Andrews and co-authors at Treasury last year. They have, this is one way in which you can present the data that they came up with. They said, okay, what would be the effect of a 5 percentage point increase in the youth unemployment rate today on young people's wages and on the proportion of them who are in employment from the time that they graduate, time that they finish education, through to 10 years afterwards. And so 0 is at the time you graduate, 10 on these graphs is 10 years after. And you can see that basically, if you graduate at a time when the unemployment rate's 5% higher, your wages are going to be about 8% lower. But then they don't immediately bounce back up to being 0. You can see, in fact, they never get back to 0. Even 10 years after, the average wage for someone who graduated when the unemployment rate was 5 percentage points higher is still 1% below compared to someone who graduated when the labour market, when the unemployment rate was 5% lower. The right-hand diagram there shows the effect on the share of the young people who are in employment. You can see that starts out at about 3.5% below if the unemployment rate was higher, and it doesn't get back to where it would have been until about 7 or 8 years afterwards. So effects on the proportion, the average proportion of young people in employment that last for sort of up to 6 or 7 years after the time of entry to the labour market. So these are obviously really sizable effects. If you accumulate the effect on sort of wages over the 10 years, then it's about it ends up being sort of about 30 to 40% over what out of a 10 years of wages. Okay, so I wanted to finish up by saying something about policy. I don't have anything hugely, I think, original to say about policy, because this is a topic that people have thought about a lot. So I think what I'm just going to be doing here is reinforcing sort of what I think is kind of the by now accepted sort of ideas on policy for improving labour market outcomes for young people. The first point to make is that the best way to increase employment of young people is not to do something specifically for young people. It's to increase the overall employment growth rate. The reason young people suffer, when you have an extended period like after the GFC, when the gap between labour demand and labour supply is growing, the reason young people suffer most during periods like COVID, or business cycle downturns, when the gap between labour supply and labour demand increases rapidly, is that they are disproportionately in the group of people who are looking for work, who are trying to get into work. And when you have this increasing gap between labour demand and labour supply, it's becoming harder to get into work. There's more people competing to get, more people wanting jobs. And it's the group of people who are trying to get into work who are going to bear the brunt. Because young people are an above average share of the group of people who are trying to get into work, they bear the brunt of these downturns. So, for example, in downturns, we know that the rate of hiring by employers decreases. But young people are an above average share of the group of who are trying to get those new jobs. So they're disproportionately adversely affected when hiring slows down. So really the best way to get young people into work is to have the macro economy running, economic growth, running as high a rate as possible, because then you get the highest overall rate of employment growth, and that that disproportionately benefits young people, because they're the ones who are going to benefit most when there's this rapid rate of new job hiring. Having said that, I think when you have a group who are as substantially disadvantaged in labour market outcomes as the young people, it's sensible to think of also having policies that bias what employment creation there is towards young people. And so the main sort of policies which exist that allow targeting of employment creation are programs like the wage subsidy program, so the job maker hiring credit. Of course, that's focused on the private sector. I guess I would have liked to see during, with the impact of COVID-19, perhaps greater thought given to short-term public sector employment as well. There's also been proposals of sort of wage subsidy plus type cadetship type schemes. Peter Hurley and Peter Dawkins, for example, from the Mitchell Institute at VU, have been pushing a proposal for a cadetship type scheme, which would involve young people getting an employment placement, doing VET or university type short program as well, study program, to supplement the work experience. The other thing is that, unfortunately, in episodes like this, it has to be accepted that the delays in improving employment growth, the limitations of policies to bias employment creation towards young people are probably going to mean that, as in fact we do observe in the data, there's an increase in the proportion of young people who are out of employment and out of education. And so it's really important to minimise the damage that comes from a period of being out of employment and out of education. And so I think they're the sort of policies that we need to be thinking of, opportunities to improve skills that don't require sort of taking on extra debt. I think also really important when we talk about these type of programs is taking account of the views of young people and what's going to help them gain employment if we're talking about expanding skills. Giving opportunities to maintain contact with the world of work, career guidance, paid internship programs, and I think also, recognising that there are a group of young people with high barriers to employment, and I think in that sense, the new employment services model, which made recommendations about really sort of better ways of more serious, more tailored service delivery to people with highest barriers of employment is something that we need to move on as quickly as possible. And then I've just finished up with, if anyone's interested in doing a bit more reading, a couple of extra references. But Paul, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to throw back to you.
Penny here.
Penny.
Really, yeah, no, all good. Fascinating. As a parent of a couple of young Australians who are both enjoying the fruits of both being in full-time study and in part-time work, it's interesting to think about the results for the kids who are, or for the young people who are actually not benefiting, who are not in full-time education at the same time as working. It's quite a marked difference. I think that was one of the things that stood out most of all for me through your presentation, that and the, I guess just to draw a connection, when we prepared our pre-budget submission earlier this year, we actually also drew on the work from the Mitchell Institute and aligned our recommendation around employment opportunities consistent with the work that those guys have done as well. So I think that's an important piece there. I've got a couple of questions for you that we might kick off with before we get to questions from our audience. One of the things that we've sort of heard anecdotally, and we've sort of had mentioned to us by a few players around the space, is this battle that seems to be emerging, this sort of tension between people who are particularly young people who are being prepared to sacrifice wages for job security and therefore take lower paid jobs in the hope that that would lead to a more secure and ongoing employment. Is that actually something that's happening, or do you have anything to sort of refute or back that up?
It's certainly the case that as I said, more young people are making the transition into full-time employment through part-time employment. So yeah, definitely having to accept sort of lower hours of work. Not so much evidence that there's been like a disproportionate increase sort of in the period, at least since the GFC, in casual employment. The proportion of casual employment for young people and people in older age groups was increasing at about the same rate, sort of in the decade after the GFC. I think the other sort of dimension of having to take a different path is the Productivity Commission work, which makes the point that people are sort of starting, young people are starting sort of lower down the job quality ladder in the way they define it than before the GFC. And so if you assume that young people today sort of have the same aspirations in terms of the jobs they ultimately, their preferred jobs, then what that means is that young people are sort of being forced to take jobs that are sort of more distant. In the Productivity Commission work, when I talk about job quality ladder, they classified occupations using like a status index for each of the jobs, and so that kind of roughly correlates with skill and sort of other features of the job. And so yeah, they were making the point that yes, people to get into work, is sort of young people are having to start sort of lower down the status ladder, and a result of that sort of taking them kind of longer to work towards the job that's their preferred job.
Yeah, no, as somebody who started out as a very junior public servant in my life, there are pathways and different places to start. My other question to you is one that I think we're particularly good at in Australia. We hear a lot about culture wars or the generation wars, and there's been a bit of press that sort of almost thrown or pitted against each other the idea of government support to older workers and government support to younger workers, and that does often lead to some sort of tension about whether the economy is supporting older workers to stay in the workforce, or whether we're supporting younger workers to enter the workforce. And we were we were jesting earlier today that maybe what we just need is more people to retire. What's sort of your thoughts on that sort of almost generational battle that's being set up largely by the media, I think, around where to make those improvements to or changes through government policy and support?
Yeah, so I guess obviously it's not sort of productive for a policy conversation to cast it in terms of sort of a battle, I don't think. But on the other hand, I think that there is a trade-off here, sort of. There is a trade-off. There is at any point of time sort of a particular amount of work, and if one age group sort of are taking up a bigger proportion of that work, then it squeezes the other. It squeezes other age groups, and basically that's one of the sort of phenomena that's been occurring for young people, those in particular who've kind of finished their education and are looking to move permanently into the workforce. I mean, I guess I wouldn't sort of be advocating bringing back mandatory retirement or policies such as that, but I think it is important for policymakers to understand that there is this trade-off, and that, for example, if you introduce policies that make delayed retirement sort of more attractive, if you're increasing the retirement age and so on, that absent sort of other policy changes, that is likely to have negative consequences on young people's ability to get into the workforce. So I think it doesn't necessarily say, well, don't introduce those policies, don't increase the retirement age. But what it says is, look, for example, well, if we do that, we're kind of expanding the size of our potential workforce. So it means we need to run macro policy harder in order to sort of be getting a faster rate of growth in labour demand. And so in that regard, I'm really sort of encouraged by sort of both the RBA governor and the Treasury secretary coming out recently and saying, well, look, we used to think that the full employment rate of unemployment was 5 or over 5, but we now think it's about 4 sort of. That's with that policy thinking, that's when you actually start to expand the total amount of employment so that you can accommodate older populations, delaying retirement, for example, but also providing employment opportunities for the young. If you don't do that, then I think you've got to say, well, what are we saying? What are we doing for young people for whom it's going to take longer to get into employment? Sort of, we got to understand, that our policies have these potential trade-offs, and we can't necessarily just have these policies that increase retirement age and so on without then realising these consequences and thinking through, well, how do we also kind of address those consequences?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think that's fascinating, and I think it goes to something we talk a lot about a lot at Racy is looking holistically. We think about looking holistically at people, but this is one of those cases where we need to look at the economy holistically. And I certainly agree with you that pitting these things as a battle against young people and older people is actually not particularly helpful for a policy debate. I have one final question before we hand to the audience. I'm particularly interested in something you mentioned in the very start of your presentation this afternoon around those. I think you mentioned 4 or 5 key industries that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and particularly the young people who work in those industries. I'm just keen on your thoughts about targeted supports to those industries now as a policy option coming out of the pandemic. Is that a viable option? Is it something that could work or that we should be looking at into the future?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my view is, and I guess you will have seen it sort of in the graphs I had about COVID, about what's happened to employment for a long. But for 2020 sort of, and this is completely correct to have this approach, I think, the whole focus of policy was on the aggregate labour market, sort of like, when you have hours worked decreased by 10.5% in 2 months, kind of, what you need to be worried about is the aggregate labour market. You need to get the aggregate labour market back on track, sort of. And so, during 2020, the focus of policy, like job policies, like JobKeeper, for example, it was broad brush. It was across the whole economy and labour market. I think that was the right approach to take. But by the end of 2020 and early 2021, really we're back to a position. We were back to a position in February where hours worked sort of only about 1 percentage point, or sorry, 1% behind where they were in March 2020. And so I think the situation has shifted in policy terms from one where we're kind of worried about the aggregate situation to one where it's now the case that there are particular pockets of activity which are still being adversely affected because there are particular ways in which the impact of COVID-19 is persisting. And then secondly, particular groups of workers, in particular these non-full-time non-full-time student young people who are being affected because they're kind of the always the worst affected in a downturn, and the effect on them then sort of persists longest. So my view on where policy should be at the moment is that on the one hand, we don't want to completely kind of withdraw from a stimulatory stance, because unemployment is still only 5.8%. We can go a way further than that. But I think the orientation of policy also really needs to shift towards targeted assistance to those industries which are still being adversely affected by COVID, and targeted assistance to the groups of workers who haven't completely recovered. So I think I think sort of that thinking in terms of, while not completely withdrawing sort of general stimulus or moving to austerity mode sort of, and that I think the sort of focus of policy should be, the balance of policy should be shifting towards targeted targeted assistance, and then the question becomes, of course, what's the best way to provide that? Is it better to do it through the demand side of the market, giving people half-price airfares, or is it more effective to directly support businesses, directly support them through continued grants and support if they're in affected industries?
Thanks. Thank you, Jeff, for a mix of both potentially. We do have one question that's come through, as we sort of forewarned there might be, about the interrelationship between the scarring that you've been talking about and impacts on mental health. I know we spoke briefly about this before we went to air, but it'd be really good if you could reiterate your comments about that, if you could, Jeff.
Sure. Yeah, that's obviously a really important topic. So, as I sort of alluded to in my talk, research in Australia on scarring effects on young people is really in its infancy. So I know that you're a research alliance. If there's anyone sort of out there who's in the health, mental health area, this would be a great sort of research topic for Australia, because, as I said, really there's only been one study done in Australia on scarring effects on young people. It was the study that I had the graphs from Treasury last year, and they were focused on the labour market, effects, as I showed, employment effects and wages effects. So there's nothing being done on that topic, as far as I should say. I guess I mainly know the economic evidence. It may be that there is some evidence from medical fields, health fields, and that which I don't know about. But at least from the economic point of view, there's nothing that I know of. I mean, two things I can say is, so in Australia there is a lot of research which looks at the contemporaneous effect of unemployment on health and mental health, and we know, so it's well established in Australia, as it is from internationally, that the contemporaneous effect of unemployment, there's a causal effect to reduce mental health, reduce well-being. So that's one thing, but that's contemporaneous, that's not scarring. The other thing to say is that internationally, there is a much larger literature on effects of scarring, and that literature does encompass studies on health and mental health. And yeah, it shows that the effect of scarring is not just restricted to those labour market outcomes of employment and wages, but as you'd kind of expect, but I guess you've got to see it in the data to know it for sure, as you'd expect, if being unemployed today means that you're more likely to be unemployed tomorrow, then it means that your mental health is likely to be lower today because you're unemployed, but also on average amongst young people lower tomorrow because there's a bigger proportion of young people who are unemployed tomorrow as well.
Thanks, Jeff. So yeah, there's a real potential cause and effect with mental health, that if you are a young person in a recession and your mental health takes a knock, it's harder to get a job, partly because getting a job is harder. And then even once the economic recovery kicks in, you're behind the 8 ball, you've been through a sort of mental trauma, and yeah, it can, so it sounds like there's a ton of research to be done there.
No,
Jeff,
that's a really important point to make as well, Paul, because yeah, I guess I've been talking about, look, there's this kind of economic event, business cycle, downturn or COVID impact on the economy, and that drives these economic outcomes, and that drives health and mental health outcomes. But yeah, it's a really important point you make, that of course, that then introduces feedbacks or causal effects both ways, that the negative effect of the economic event on health and mental health can then reinforce the negative effect of the economic event on outcomes like employment. And that's why I say with the in the policy stuff, it's really important to kind of minimise the damage from not employed, not in education, because that damage is not just reducing people's incomes while they're in that state. It's about mental health sort of. And so if you don't, if you kind of just work on the margin of saying, well, look, we're going to do our best to get as many young people as we can into work during those periods, then that's good. But it neglects the fact that, look, if you've had a really serious downturn, there's going to be some increase in the proportion of young people not employed, not in education, and to neglect that group, is really setting up for long-term unemployment, long-term periods out of unemployment for that group. So I think it's really important that when we're thinking about policy, that we think about getting young people into work, but we also recognise that, look, even with the best policy endeavours, when you've had shocks that are as big as COVID sort of, or what was happening in the decade after the GFC, that you're not going to get everyone back into employment in an instant. So you've got to worry about what you're doing for people who aren't in employment and education as well, or else you're kind of you're not doing the job completely.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And thanks for tying that up at the end, that feedback loop stuff. That's really useful, and I'm sure our audience will really appreciate that. Jeff, as I say, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone attending today. That's the end of today's webinar. A recording of the webinar will be made available, as I said. Keep an eye on our weekly e-bulletin, and if you don't currently subscribe to our e-bulletin, just Google Eracy and register, and it will take you to the registration page where you can get our free weekly e-bulletin, which is full of recordings such as this and all sorts of news and goings on and events. As we approach the Commonwealth budget, thought to be handed down on the 11th of May, but I still haven't seen a confirmation around that. We're running a number of other webinars, and keep an eye on our newsletter again for the details. That's it for today. Again, our thanks, Jeff. Very informative. I had no idea the extent of the volatility and the difference in employment recovery rates, if that's the right word, between young people and the broader population. Very informative. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks again to everyone in the audience, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That's the end of the broadcast. Thank you.